All right, welcome for Leviticus chapter 2. Before we get into the chapter today, I want to give a quick overview of the types of laws we will be seeing going forward in our Old Testament readings. The law of God given to Moses is a comprehensive set of guidelines to ensure that the Israelites' behavior reflected their status as God's chosen people. It encompasses moral behavior as a godly example to other nations and systematic procedures for acknowledging God's holiness and mankind's sinfulness. In an attempt to better understand the purpose of these laws, Jews and Christians categorized them. This has led to the distinction between moral law, ceremonial law, and judicial law. Moral law relates to justice and judgment and is often translated as ordinances. Its purpose is to promote the well-being of those who obey. These laws include the Ten Commandments and penalties for failure to obey them. The purpose of moral law is to illuminate the fallen state of mankind. Ceremonial law was put in place to bring one's attention to God. These are your sacrifices, feasts and festivals, specific regulations meant to distinguish Israelites from pagan neighbors, including dietary and clothing restrictions, and signs that point to the coming Messiah. This is going to be mostly what we'll see in Leviticus. Galatians chapter 3, verse 23 through 25 explains that since Jesus has come, Christians are not required to sacrifice or circumcise. Colossians chapter 2 and Romans chapter 14 explain that Jesus has fulfilled the Sabbath by becoming our Sabbath rest. The applicability of the Old Testament law in the life of a Christian has always related to its usefulness in loving God and loving others. Judicial laws, the number 3, were specifically given for the culture and place of the Israelites and encompass all the moral law except the Ten Commandments. And we saw a lot of this in the book of Exodus. All the law is useful for instruction and is used as a tutor to point us to Christ. Christians are not under the law, as Romans chapter 10 verse 14 states. Romans 10 verse 4. Jesus fulfilled it, thus abolishing the difference between Jew and Gentile, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross. That is seen in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 15 through 16. Okay, so let's get back to Leviticus. I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the type of laws we're going to see. And here we go, verse 1. Now when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and shall take from his handful of its fine flour and of its oil with all of its frankincense. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke as its memorial portion on the altar, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons, a thing most holy, of the offerings to the Lord by fire. Verse 4. Now when you bring an offering of a grain offering baked in an oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers spread with oil. If your offering is a grain offering made on the griddle, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. You shall break it into bits and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. And this is the first time in history that the world received the term cakes on the griddle, and I'm very grateful for that. Verse 7. Now if your offering is a grain offering made in a pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. When you bring in the grain offering, which is made of these things to the Lord, it shall be presented to the priest, and he shall bring it to the altar. Verse 9. The priest then shall take up from the grain offering its memorial portion, and shall offer it up in smoke on the altar as an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons, a thing most holy, of the offerings to the Lord by fire. No grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall not offer up in smoke any leaven or any honey as an offering by fire to the Lord. As an offering of first fruits you shall bring them to the Lord, but they shall not ascend for a soothing aroma on the altar. Verse 13. Every grain offering of yours, moreover, you shall season with salt. so that the salt of the covenant of your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. All right, I'm going to pause for a minute and we're going to discuss grain offering. A grain offering would have most likely been of wheat or barley, depending on what was available. While other sacrifices had very specific instructions from God as to how they were to be offered, the rules governing grain offerings had some flexibility. A grain offering could be given to God either uncooked or cooked in an oven or a pan. The requirements for the grain offering were that it had to be finely ground and have oil and salt in it. It could not have any leaven or honey in it. When a person brought a grain offering to the priests, a small portion of it was offered to God, with some frankincense on the altar. The rest of the grain offering went to the priests. No specific amount of grain was required for an offering. People were free to give what they had. The grain offering is described as a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord. Grain offerings would often be presented after a burnt offering, which was an animal sacrifice God required for the atonement of sin. Blood had to be shed for the remission of sins to take place, so a grain offering would not serve the same purpose as a burnt offering. Instead, the purpose of a grain offering was to worship God and acknowledge His provision. The burnt offering, which had strict regulations and could have nothing added to it, represents the fact that we take no part in our atonement for sin. The grain offering, however, could be somewhat personalized in its presentation. It was to be given out of a person's free will, just as our worship is our free will offering to God today. It's interesting to note that during the Israelites' 40 years of wilderness wandering, grain would have been quite scarce. This made grain offerings more costly and precious for the people to offer to God. Giving a grain offering in those circumstances represented the Israelites' complete dependence on God to provide for their needs of each day. Okay, sorry for that interruption, but I think we needed to go over that. So verse 14. Also, if you bring a grain offering of early ripened things to the Lord, you shall bring fresh heads of grain roasted in the fire, grits of new growth, for the grain offering of your early ripened things. You shall then put oil on it and lay incense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest shall offer up in smoke its memorial portion, part of its grits and its oil with all its incense as an offering by fire to the Lord. And it's interesting that in John chapter 12, verses 23 and 24, it says, "And Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." So just some food for thought there. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much. Hope to see you tomorrow for Leviticus chapter 3. God bless you.